Welcome to another edition of Paul's Security Weekly Vault. This episode was previously recorded on April 5th, 2012, and features an interview with none other than Dan Geer. Unfortunately, there is no video for this episode, but I've gone back and listened and can say the content is still relative today. Dan Geer, of course, is a renowned cybersecurity expert and visionary. With a wealth of knowledge and experience in the field, Dan has made significant contributions to our understanding of information security and its implications. In this interview, we explore his background, education, and delve into some of his most influential works, such as his paper on the security implications of monoculture. My co-hosts for this interview included Jack Daniel and John Strand. At the very end of the interview, we talk about how Dan was giving the keynote at Source Boston 2012. I've included a link to the video of that talk in the show notes for historical reference. ChatGPT summarized his keynote as follows, stating, Dan Geer discusses the claim that the internet is critical infrastructure and explores the potential hypocrisy involved in this assertion. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder that I post clips from the shows, funny memes, tech tips, and more to all of my social media outlets, including Twitter, Mastodon, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find links to each of those on my website at securitypodcaster.com. Now, without further ado, enjoy our interview with Dan Geer. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Please join us in welcoming Dan Geer to the show, Chief Information Security Officer at In-Q-Tel. Let's see, Dan Geer is, of course, entrepreneur, author, scientist, consultant, teacher. I read some very interesting things this week about Dan, which I'd like to share with our listeners, some of the stuff that I had not known previously. He served as Chief Scientist Emeritus and Vice President of Verticis, and he was also the Chief Technology Officer of At Stake, as well as the Head of Systems Development at MIT's Project Athena, which I recognize from when I actually used to work at Brown. The first large-scale academic distributed computing and networking environment, where his staff, on his watch, pioneered Kerberos, the X-Window system, and much of what we all take for granted in distributed computing, which I thought was really neat. Dan has testified before Congress on multiple occasions and has served in formal advisory roles for Federal Trade Commission, National Science Foundation, the Treasury Department, and several others. He has served as the president of USENIX, the Advanced Computing Systems Association, and holds degrees from both Harvard and MIT, which is interesting because our next guest also holds a degree from MIT. Both are guests. Welcome, Dan, to the show.
Thank you.
So, Dan, how did you get your start in information security?
Well, everybody my age got their start accidentally. So I'll say that, meaning we all came at it from somewhere else and we didn't have any training and, the like. But you already touched on it. The start actually was running development for Athena at MIT, and Kerberos was one of the things we did. As it happens, any university research and development project, of course, has a faculty member in charge. In this case, the faculty member was Jerry Salzer, who you may know from Salzer, Clark, and Reed, the end-to-end principle, or his student just previously had been Mike Schroeder, as in the Needham and Schroeder protocol. And so Kerberos, fell out, if you will, directly from stuff that was already known by Jerry and within the community at MIT was already known. And we implemented it. And that's how I got to start. I didn't realize at the time that it was a start, but the true answer is it dates all the way back to there. And you might say, well, what was there? And the answer is roughly 1986.
Mm-hmm. So what was it like working on the Athena project at MIT?
Well, it was quite fascinating. I ran development. I ran the systems development. There was also an application development side of the house that was directly responsible for the educational aspect of what Athena was supposed to be. I just I just ran the part that built the systems, and it turned out in the end that, of course, unless you build something that's reasonably reliable and all of that, that faculty members won't commit their courses to it. That sounds unsurprising after the fact, but at the time it was a, shall we say, discovery. The thing that I liked the most about it was we were backed jointly by Digital Equipment Corporation, may it rest in peace, and IBM. And we got a fair amount of money and a lot of machinery and staff from both. And because both were sponsoring it, MIT negotiated with both jointly, and we ended up, for anybody who's ever read, for example, the license that's attached to the X window system, we ended up with a license that anybody was free to use it, which is actually rather distinct from the Free Software Foundation kind of license. When we started giving things away, we didn't actually care what happened to them. Our assumption, of course, was that if we gave away, I'll continue to use X as the example, if we give away the X window system, that in fact stuff would eventually start coming back to us because other people would be using it. And, anytime you give away good tools for nothing, people will use them. And I think the most interesting part to me was the impact of giving it away. And that really actually began in 1988 with there were several university projects of various sorts going on at the time, but between the MIT Athena Project and the Carnegie Mellon Andrew Project, we shared a whole day of the program at the winter Usenix meeting that year. And one thing led to another, and we ended up, I won't say merging the two efforts, but it was quite fascinating. We were doing a file system. We quit doing that. We adopted AFS. They were doing an authentication system. They dropped that. They started using Kerberos and back and forth. And we were both in this sphere of giving stuff away, but it turned out, well, why duplicate? And just one thing led to another. And, I could belabor this infinitely, but I will say that at that point, and by 1988, in the visitor center at Athena, we were seeing 3,000 people a year. So the aspect of good code that you can walk away with was generating us 3,000 visitors a year and the like, and the rest of it just spread.
Right. Now, did you have to deal with any security incidents when you worked there, or if not, what was some of the first security problems you had to deal with?
Well, you have to remember that at a place like MIT, the best way you can get something broken into is to announce that nobody can.
Yeah.
And results follow. But perhaps you remember the Morris worm?
Yes.
Well, that occurred at that time. In fact, I think one of the best write-ups of it was Mark Eichen and John Rockless, who were on my staff, wrote a piece called "With Microscope and Tweezers," and you can read that someday about the Morris worm. Actually, I missed the excitement because a statistics department, which had given me a free account that I had forgotten that I had and had never used, called up to ask why I was beating the daylights out of their machinery. Would I please come down and stop what I was doing? Of course, I didn't know anything about this at all, and of course, it turned out it was the Morris worm beating their machinery all to bits, and I didn't know that the rest of the world was getting beaten to bits. I was trying to help my friends in the stat department.
Right.
So yes, there was a security event, but and that was relatively famous, of course. But I missed the action because I was trying to solve it on my own, not realizing that it was a pandemic.
Right. So I wanted to talk about some of the problems that monoculture may breed, and specifically talk about Microsoft, and kind of talk about some of the things that you discussed in 2003 with respects to Microsoft, and how things have evolved since then in respects to monocultures and or specifically the monopoly that Microsoft had or has, and how that intersects with security.
Well, when I and my colleagues, there were 7 of us, wrote the Monoculture piece in 2003. If you read it carefully, it doesn't necessarily say that just because it's the folks in Redmond, we have a problem. It says that any monopoly would be a problem so long as that monopoly is itself vulnerable. And that was, of course, the case in 2003. if I may say so, spectacularly the case. And the point we were making, I said before I didn't start out in security because you couldn't. I'm actually trained as a statistician, back to the Harvard degree. I'm a biostatistician by training. So disease models make sense to me. Hence, the monoculture argument makes sense to me. You know, if you have, if everybody in the Midwest planted exactly the same strain of corn, it wouldn't take much for a disease to spread, and so forth and so forth. And that's where we got the idea, which is a direct biologic analogy, and just because, again, I had disease models on the brain. Since then, Microsoft has done a very good job. They got religion, as the saying goes. I think they got religion in part because people from Wall Street showed up and said, if you don't fix this, we're going somewhere else. And that, by the way, is a literal meeting that did happen. But in any case, the issue at the time was that it was not appreciated that there were side effects of, in this case, and in my view, a market failure, which resulted in everybody using the same code. And by the way, that code is vulnerable. And we wrote the paper explicitly to say that this is a national security question. And in so many words, it wouldn't matter if it was these guys. It happens that these are the guys, and it happens their code is full of holes, and it happens that, it's a lot easier to write an exploit when you only have to write one as opposed to 10 million. And by the way, would you pay attention, friends in Congress? So that's how we got there.
Are there examples of monopolies today that pose the same threat, or have things kind of gotten better as there are more and more technology companies, for example?
It's an interesting trade-off. It's really an interesting trade-off, I would say. I'm actually very, despite what you might think, I'm extremely sympathetic to the idea of having everything just alike. And the reason I'm sympathetic to that is that if everything's just alike, it makes the management problem easier. And so if you view the main threat to the computing infrastructure in the broad sense to be that of cascade failure, the failure of one node leads to the failure of another, which leads to the failure of another. If you view it that way, then diversity has got to be part of the solution. If, on the other hand, you view it as the absence of good management or the failure to configure consistently or something along those lines, not so much a failure of design, but a failure of discipline. If you view the problem as chiefly a failure of discipline, then your answer would be to make everything just alike, because then discipline will be easier. And so I'm sympathetic to both halves of this argument. In 2003, going back quite some time, I wasn't sympathetic to ignoring the question. Now, as of today, we do a lot of things that are rather monocultural. Examples include how the backbone of the internet works. The percentage of backbone routers that are made by one company.
Right.
We have the same problem in some cases with protocols. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't think of a protocol as an issue of this sort, but it can be an issue of this sort. Myself and a guy named Marsh Ray did a paper a while ago talking about episodes where there have been discoveries in protocols where if you are compatible with the protocol, in other words, if your standard's compliant, you are by definition vulnerable. The one that Marsh Ray had discovered is fairly famous, and that was in transport layer security, SSL if you want to call it that, but in the TLS start problem. And there was a feature in the standard which, if implemented per the standard, produced a vulnerability. That's a kind of the same phenomenon. Or for that matter, how many ASN1 compilers are there? Or more to the point, how many code bases for the ASN1 compiler are there? That's another example of a place where there's a shortage of diversity. On the other hand, if diversity gets out of hand, if diversity just goes, to the limit, I'm not sure what you do.
Right. So does diversity come from people interpreting the standards in different ways and then developing the protocol slightly differently or implementing the protocol slightly differently. Therefore, not people that may have deviated a little bit from the standard aren't vulnerable if there's a problem in the standard.
Well, the argument would be if two independent teams program the same thing, they won't necessarily come up with the code identical.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, that's the way your body works too. You and I and everybody else listening to this are, I don't know what the figure would be, 99.99% exactly alike. But it's useful to have a little bit of difference, and a little bit of difference that just says, how should I put this? One of the great desires of everybody in programming, of course, is to have as much reusable code as possible. Reuse of code means that if there's something wrong with it, you get the something wrong with it. Of course, if there means something right with it, you get that as well. It's just two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know quite what to tell you about that. Node.js, the JavaScript quote server unquote code, there's one code base for that so far as I know. Suppose it was adopted everywhere. Or let's pick on something that's bigger, Apache. You've of course heard Eric Raymond's comment that with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow.
Mm-hmm.
That's true unless, of course, there's a design flaw. And so, like everything else in security, you're trading off probabilities of things that are hard to measure. On the one hand, is there a design flaw, so we shouldn't all do it? If we do it all the same way, we're all hosed. On the other hand, is this code complicated enough that various people should not be writing it? How many air traffic control systems do you really want? And the answer is probably not many. It is a constant trade-off, and it's an impossible question to answer in a binary fashion.
Mm. Yeah, it's really thought-provoking. I always kind of thought of the open source model as, well, there's a lot of eyes on it, so we should all find the problems. But if we're all only looking at our kind of various individual pieces, no one may really see for a long time the underlying design flaw that makes you vulnerable. That's pretty fascinating.
Well, I'm not making fun of this at all, but open source software tends to accumulate features faster than closed source.
Yes.
Which, by the way, is exactly what you see in standards committees. When you have standards committees, how do you get a standard? And the answer is everybody gets the feature they were looking for, so they get a yes vote.
It's so true. It's so true. What are some cases for monoculture and where it really, really can help us? And I think this kind of speaks to the management issue. Are there circumstances where monoculture really, truly helps security?
Well, if it's small enough that you can analyze it, you're probably better off. I mean, imagine for a second that there was a core driver in all the SCADA systems that was small enough that we could actually, and having enough eyeballs and finding the shallow bugs, blah, blah, blah. Suppose that there was a core part of the SCADA system that we could actually, as a community, beat to the ground and satisfy ourselves that it just didn't have any flaws. That would be useful because SCADA systems go in places where people don't sit.
Mm.
They go in places where there isn't a human. Remember, humans' a special skill is detecting patterns or detecting differences in patterns. Saying, that didn't sound right, or why is the color off, or so forth and so forth. That ability of humans to detect small changes in pattern is one of our great strengths. It's how, we got out of caves because we learned how to hunt better. Embedded systems don't have that advantage because we hide them all over the place.
Mm.
If we do that, it would be swell because, again, they're not being observed by a human, which, at least so far, is the pinnacle pattern recognizer. It would be nice if they were provably secure. Provably secure, of course, is a very difficult problem, and I'm not really going there. I'm just saying it would be nice if they were close to provably secure. And so suppose that we could collectively, you and I, and everybody else on the line here, could pick some part of the SCADA system and beat it to the ground, and it would be safe. We'd be better off. So that I could go for.
Mm.
Probably the same thing in some chip design. Probably the same thing in at least agreement on what some sorts of signals mean. I would hate to think that the signals coming out of transponders on airplanes were radically different, so you had to be really, really sure you knew what transponder they were using before you could tell what it was saying. That would be unfortunate.
I find, though, Dan, I want to get your perspective on this, that economics often, when you talk about the embedded situation and monoculture, kind of play in that manufacturers of the different technologies will very quickly abandon one kind of platform for a different one because the new one is cheaper. And so what you get is all of these different systems. Like if I look around my house or at an airport, God forbid, there's tons of different embedded systems everywhere, and they're all slightly different because I think, one, they're kind of special purpose, and two, I think that manufacturers will jump to whatever is most economical for them and kind of abandon, any unified platform that would provide any security. Does that play into why?
I don't play in that in manufacturing economics much, but someone explained to me the other day that what memory chips, for example, are actually in low-end consumer routers, the kind of thing you can get at Best Buy or Micro Center or whatever.
Yep.
Those are, talk about just-in-time delivery. They're just basically bought at auction the day before.
Mm-hmm.
And so which brand of memory chips is in those things is, in fact, utterly arbitrary. It isn't even spec'd. And so I think that's, if my informant on that was correct, you can't get more abandonment than, we bought whatever was at the market this morning.
Right.
You can't beat that. And of course, that's why home routers are as cheap as they are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah.
Your observation, of course, is absolutely correct. I have to stop for a minute and decide and think hard before I decide that that's a problem or a feature.
Right. Yeah. Does that help us? I mean, what I found, spending a lot of space in the consumer embedded networking system space, I find it helps the security because I can't find a common point of attack for long enough to be effective.
Let's go back to Microsoft for a second. ASLR. Mm-hmm. Which stands for, let me think now, Address Space Location Randomization.
Mm-hmm.
That was, all right, I'll brag a little here. I believe that was their answer to my complaint. My complaint that it was too easy when you got a buffer overflow, for example, because you knew where to jump. If you managed to find a buffer overflow, which could easily occur in something that Microsoft didn't write.
Right.
But once you'd gotten control of the program counter, so to speak, you knew where to go. And so ASLR was a great solution to that problem. And in my view, it was their answer to, it's all alike. Their answer was, no, it isn't. And it was actually very clever because these days I do think that building for intrusion tolerance is a more worthwhile goal than building for intrusion immunity.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
there seem to be so many ways to break in that claiming you have counted them all and every one of them you have dealt with, wishful thinking most days. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you can say, even when they break in, nothing happens, which, continue the buffer overflow example, even if someone gets a buffer overflow, they don't know where to jump. Well, that's useful.
Mm. Yeah, and if you talk to exploit developers today, they'll all tell you that protections such as that have definitely slowed it down. The whole economy basically around exploits has slowed down.
Well, it certainly moved the easiest to attack part from the keyboard to the human.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Finding a way to spoof you is probably easier than finding a way to spoof some of the operating system features such as you're describing. Mm.
So do we need to come up with an alternative to the monoculture of the species using the computers?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Dan, what are your thoughts on APT, the Advanced Persistent Threat? Is this really a new trend, or is it really just old news with a different spin?
Well, about 5 years ago, I would guess it's 5, the attack class moved from being amateurs and braggarts to being professionals. And the professionals are different than the braggarts in one critical way. If you're doing hacking or whatever you want to call it, I'm old enough that I hate using the word hacking this way, but I'll do it. If the hacking is for bragging rights, then the only way you get them is to announce what you found. If, on the other hand, the hacking is for money, you don't announce what you found. And so when the opposition moved over from being adventurers and braggarts to being professionals, the percentage of all exploitable vulnerabilities that, quote, we, unquote, know about must have begun to fall. Because the ones that are discovered by people who are paid to do it do not enter into the bragging arena. They disappear into the black. And I think that's important. Do I think that APT is just a smooth curve, a continuation of that? Well, yes and no. Mostly no. And the reason I say it's not just a smooth curve, but it actually is a moment in time, it's something to think about, is that it's pretty clear that a lot of it is, if not state-sponsored, is state-tolerated. I wrote on this recently, and I didn't, come on here to have a geopolitical discussion per se, but if you look at the rate of growth in China, 8%, in fact, some years it's been as high as 12%, conventional economists would say that a regular, mature economy cannot grow faster than 4% per year on a sustained basis. That if you're getting 4%, everybody's happy. If you're getting less than that, if you go back down to zero, incumbents get voted out of office. But somewhere in the range of 0 to 4 is about the best that a fully engaged economy can do. The only way that you grow faster than that is that you transfer in technology or something. You take, for example, factories. When I was a little boy, my daddy worked for textile mills. How many textile mills are there in the U.S. anymore? The answer is they moved where labor was cheaper. And when you move the easy-to-do factories, textile mills are easy to do. They've been easy to do for 200 years. When you move them somewhere else, that contributes to growth that might well be faster than 4%. But eventually you run out of things like that, like textile mills or basic iron or, things like that, and you start having to do things that are harder. At some point you come to the stage where the amount of know-how that has to be transferred cannot be gotten just by walking around and drawing pictures and taking photographs, but you either have to partner with somebody who wants to give you the technology or you have to steal it. Mm-hmm. So I conclude, and this was in the article, I conclude that for China, intellectual property theft is a critical infrastructure. Now, does APT figure in that? Hell yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this is about.
Is that so? How do you say in Chinese, win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat? Is that applicable?
Well, you'll have to figure that out.
Yeah.
My Chinese is non-existent. So,
Hey, Dan, what was the name of that article again for our listeners?
When 80 billion is not enough.
When 80 billion is not enough. We can get that added into the show notes.
That was in the IEEE Security and Privacy magazine.
Okay. Yeah, we'll add a reference to that. Absolutely.
One of the things that, just to jump in, one of the things that is interesting is this is not just a high-tech problem. And I've talked about this before, but it's interesting to talk about, espionage and industrial espionage. And I just got into this with somebody today on Twitter. And, we're here in Rhode Island, and throughout the northeastern U.S., we wouldn't have had the industrial revolution we had we not had people that stole textile technologies from Britain. There's a substantial difference in the scale of the two economies and the amount of damage that was done and the power
Absolutely
of Britain
true.
at the time. But
Absolutely true.
it was stolen. And, to something that's more personal, the hobby that I don't have time for is I'm an amateur blacksmith. I like to put things in the fire and hit them with a hammer. My professional blacksmith friends have learned to only put low-resolution images of their most artistic and best-selling works on their websites, because the ones that had high-quality galleries would go into, and we all know the stores, the Pier 1s and Christmas tree shops and whatever that have that knockoff Chinese stuff. So the guys that are standing at a forge hammering out flowers are actually seeing their same product being stolen right off their websites. This is, not a new issue, and the situation, the stakes may be higher too, as you said. When you're talking about an economy and a population the size of China, the stakes of this become dramatically higher than one craftsman in New Hampshire having to come up with a new line of fireplace tools. But
I'm glad you said that, because to a degree we often think that something about computers makes them a one-of-a-kind, unique thing in all of history and in all of industry and so forth. It ain't so.
Dan, what are some of the biggest mistakes that people are making when they are measuring risk for their organizations?
How much time do you have? I'm just teasing you. Well, people naturally measure the things that they know how to measure. Everybody's seen that cartoon of, why are you looking here? Because the light's better. It's easy to measure process. And process is useful. I'm not making fun of process, particularly if the process answers threats that are not going away, that are going to be there all day, every day, forever. Then process is a good answer. But the biggest threats are ones that you didn't know were coming. And so to a degree, and this goes back to the point about intrusion tolerance versus intrusion protection. Suppose, for example, I don't know how you're going to break in, but I know what you want when you get there. Well, maybe I should alarm what it is you're going to steal and put little money into making sure you can't get in. If you can get in, but you can't do anything, you're winning. Paralleling that with measurement. Can I measure the things which are early indicators of future trends? And that's, of course, the same game that our friends in intelligence play. So in many ways, I think cybersecurity is converged in terms of its native art, is converging with intelligence agencies. Because both of us are trying to see through a dark fog and anticipate the future, because reactions cannot be after the fact, because, if I steal your data, you'll never get it. Even if you get it back, how do you know that you got it back? If I steal your car and the police recover it, you at least have your car. It may have a ding or whatever, but there's your car, and you know that
make a copy
once you
of
get
the
it
car.
back, I don't have it. With the data, there's no way to ever know that again.
Right.
So anticipation and being able to say, this is going to be a problem is really important. Take, for example, a current issue on the table that just every big company is wrestling with the idea of how do we let people bring their own PCs to work? The consumerization argument. Or if not the PC, the smartphone. How do we let people use their own smartphone or a smartphone we gave them or whatever it is for both business purposes and private purposes? And is that likely to be a problem? Well, if you ask the average security officer on Wall Street, what is the big, if they could, rub the lamp and the genie appears, but you only get to fix one thing, what would you fix? And the answer for most of them would be keyloggers. In a setting where a device is used both for personal and for business purposes, how do you make sure that when they do the personal things, some of which may be dangerous, that it doesn't bleed? Now, I'm only picking on this because the question is, how could you anticipate this? And what would you do in advance? Jim Beeson, who's a CISO for GE Capital, it has a very fascinating stump speech, which you might want to have him on the show. I'll tell you what the title of his speech is. I don't buy your shoes. Why should I buy your computer? And he talks about this a lot. On the other hand, my friends in intelligence agencies can't have cell phones. So somewhere in the range in between there is where most people fall.
Right.
And so thinking about the future, thinking about what should I measure, I'd like to think, what measurements could I take that would allow me to foresee when something was coming for which, once it had arrived, it would be too late for me to build a protection. Does that make sense in English?
It does. So, Dan, along those lines, the final question, because we're starting to run a little short on time, is something that Jack and I myself and John have been talking about a lot, and we're looking for ways to measure the effectiveness of the IT security department, right? So we see all these companies and they have breaches, right? A good percentage of them now, we see in the news, they've got all these breaches. And we see other companies, maybe in lesser in number, which are really hardened. And we're like, well, what is the difference? And one of the factors we're working with is, how much of the effectiveness and size of the IT security department weigh into that equation. So, for example, if you have really talented people and the right number of people, are those the ones not getting breached? And how do we weigh how much talent we should have in the IT department to make us more secure?
That's a good question. Again, just to share something else that you can share with your listeners later, because I'll tell you where to look for it. I gave a talk in February at a interesting little conference in Washington called Suits and Spooks, just what it sounds like. And in that, I laid out what I think is the question that you're asking, and that is, are people in the loop a fail-safe or a liability? Are we at the point where automating, in other words, turning over protection to machines, is the only thing we can do? Is that the right thing to do? And if it is the right thing to do, is there still a role for a human in the loop? And by the way, I think the answer is we pretty much have to use machines, and two, damn well better have a human in the loop somewhere.
Right, because we don't want to be like the Terminator or the Matrix, right?
The Terminator or the Matrix, or, exactly right. I'll give you two examples. I know a bank in New York which has put an awful lot of automation into what I know to call deprovisioning, which is, I turn in my letter of resignation. They have, 300 seconds to make it where I can't log in or, anything else. How fast can you take away all the things that otherwise I could have done, except that I hadn't turned in my letter of resignation, right? Mm-hmm. And this particular bank actually coded for, I'm proud of them for this, they actually coded for if they get 50 of these in an hour, that system stops and insists on a human coming and saying it may proceed. Because the last thing they need is for it to get out of hand and erase everybody's authority at once.
Right.
Right? And that's where the matrix comes in, if you will.
Right.
You got to make sure that, if you discover that you had a loop in that program, it would be a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And speaking personally, once upon a time, actually this goes all the way back to Athena days, I managed to distribute a Etsy password to a bunch of Unix timeshare machines, about 75 in number, which didn't have root in it. Well, that was a mistake, which required going to every console and booting it hard, and typing from the console and, so forth. So it can happen. It can happen. Mm-hmm. The other aspect of another example I have, and this was a finesse, and I don't know how to tell you to find this kind of finesse in your examples, but you mentioned that I used to work at Vertices. We sold a data protection product. We sold into a hospital. In this particular hospital, the chief of medicine said, under no circumstances can this data protection product get in the way of patient care. If somebody needs the data, they get the data. We're not going to kill people just to, look good. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the general counsel says, under no circumstances are we going to violate federal PII rules. These rules are not a joke. We are not going to do it. People do not get data to which they're not entitled. Now, of course, as you can well imagine, those have collision. And so the finesse they did, which is they used the product that we sold them, they never block access to data. But instead, when somebody goes to make a reference to data that they shouldn't, a little window pops up and says, Dan, against policy, click here to proceed. And so chief of medicine knows that under no circumstances will the data be prevented. And the general counsel gets, Dan cannot go and say, I didn't mean to. You established intent. And you have a record of the event. So you're never left in the dark and saying, I didn't know it was stolen. And you're never in a situation where Dan says, I didn't mean to do it, and I don't know what happened. Mm-hmm. That was a finesse, in my view. And looking for those will help you answer the question of how much of the protection do you turn over to machines. And again, look up Suits and Spooks was the name of the thing. Mm-hmm. And I have a copy on my trivial little website, which, if you like, I'll email it to you. Is that the thing to do?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, that's what I'll do. Okay.
Awesome.